Hello learners, in this video lecture I am going to talk about poetry and its types. So here are some definitions of poetry by the famous poets of their time. William Wordsworth defined poetry as the spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling which takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility. In the views of Robert Frost, poetry is when an emotion has found its thought and the thought has found words. Matthew Arnold said, poetry is at bottom a criticism of life. In his views, poetry is a kind of assessment of human life. Types of poetry. Poetry has three genres or categories. The first of them is lyrical poetry. The second one is narrative poetry. And the third one is dramatic poetry. Let's understand all these types one by one. So the first type of poetry is lyrical poetry. When we talk about the origin of lyrical poetry, it was originated in ancient Greece as a song. And that time it used to be sung with a musical instrument lyre. The chief characteristic of this kind of poetry is that it expresses intense personal emotions or feelings of the poet. It is highly musical and usually short in length. As it expresses personal emotions, so it is subjective. Lyrical poetry includes sonnet, elegy, ode, haiku. Sonnet. Sonnet is a short lyric of 14 lines usually written in iambic pentameter. For example, On His Blindness by John Milton. And Sonnet 18, which starting line is Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer Day by William Shakespeare. Elegy. Elegy is a song of lamentation or a poem that expresses sadness, especially for somebody who has died. And sometimes it is a poem that is written in praise of someone who has died. For example, O Captain, My Captain by Walt Whitman. And Elegy written in a country churchyard by Thomas Gray. Ode. Ode is a poem that is written in praise of a person, thing or event. It is a kind of address to a direct or an indirect object. For example, Ode to a Nightingale by John Keats and Ode to the West Wind by P.B. Shelley. Haiku. Haiku is a very short form of Japanese poetry in 3 lines. It contains 14 syllables in which the first line has 5 syllables, the second line has 7 syllables and the third line has 5 syllables. This kind of poems are commonly written on the subject of nature. For example, The Narrow Road to the Deep North by Matsuo Basho. Another type of poetry is narrative poetry. As in ancient time, poetry was not written but recited or spoken, so narrative poetry was emerged from oral tradition. Narrative poetry includes long poems that tell non-dramatic stories. In narrative poetry, a story is told in words in a chronological order by a narrator. Another important point regarding narrative poetry is it begins with exposition provided by the narrator. Narrative poetry includes epic and ballad. Epic. Epic is a long narrative poem which is written on a serious subject told in a formal and elevated style. It is all about heroic deeds. For example, Iliad and Odyssey by Homer and Mahabharat by Maharshi Vyas. Ballad. Ballad is an old story in verse that was handed over orally from one generation to another generation. It tells an old story, usually written in 4-line stanza that is also known as quatrain, out of which only the second and the fourth lines rhyme. For example, La Belle Dame Sans Mercy by John Keats and The Rime of the Ancient Mariner by S.T. Coleridge. The last one is dramatic poetry. Dramatic poetry encloses a highly emotional story in verse. It usually mentions a specific situation. Another important point regarding dramatic poetry is that it begins with the characters entering the scene and speaking their own words. Dramatic poetry includes dramatic monologue. Dramatic monologue is a speech of a single person, as the word monologue is made of two different words, mono plus log. Mono means single and log means speech. So, dramatic monologue is a speech of a single person in which the person interacts with one person or more people dramatically. For example, Ulysses by Lord Alfred Tennyson, My Last Duchess by Robert Browning, and Dover Beach by Matthew Arnold. So this way we have discussed poetry and its types. In my next lecture, I will be dealing with another genre of literature, that is drama. Thank you for watching this.